Here's what you've been missing over at patreon.com/addressing Gettysburg.
You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome again to Addressing Gettysburg. And we have with us one of our favorite guests to have on the show, Scott Hartwig. Hello, Scott.
Hello. Good to be here.
It's good to have you, as always. Every once in a while, I go, it's time to have Scott back on, and I'll go scour the internet to see something that you might have written that would be interesting to have you talk about. And I sent you, I forgot what it was, but for some reason it came up when I searched your name, and it was something somebody else had written, and I sent you a link to it, and I said, would you want to come on and talk about this? You're like, well, I don't really know a lot about that because I didn't write that, you moron. But you did recommend what we're talking about today. It was an article that you wrote for the Park Service blog in October of 2011. It's called The Romances of Gettysburg, Get Those Shoes. And I was so glad to see that you had written something on this topic, because it is one of these things that just plagues us all when you meet someone, especially when they're new to it. And it's nothing against them because it's not their fault, but they'll say, oh, I can't believe this was all fought over shoes. But it wasn't all fought over shoes. So explain, what made you decide to write this, and what was it really about? Where does the shoe myth come from?
Well, if you do any casual reading about Gettysburg, even some decent books that have been written about Gettysburg in the past, you will almost always encounter the story that on July the 1st, Henry Heath, who commanded an infantry division, one of the 9 divisions in Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, came to Gettysburg on July the 1st for the purpose of securing a supply of shoes that he had learned were in the town, and that his men needed shoes badly. So he marched to go get those shoes. He was taken completely by surprise that the Union Army was there, and the battle was precipitated. And it wasn't Heath's fault. It was just, they didn't have the intelligence they needed. And the kind of amusing, comical part of this is that for decades, really question. Well, there were some people, but historians didn't question Heath's account. They generally accepted Heath's account of why he came to Gettysburg on July the 1st. So why did they do that? I think part of the reason why people did it, was it's a fun story, and it's an easy way to remember how a huge battle begins. And people love those sort of ironic things. Here we have one of the biggest battles that ever occurs in North America, and it's fought because the Confederates were marching to Gettysburg looking for shoes. It's preposterous. It's fantastic.
Yes.
And if you were one of the very early guides at Gettysburg, what an easy way to explain to people how the battle came on.
Right.
The Confederates were just coming here looking for shoes. Very easy. So I think it was the convenience of this simple story that you could tell. People love simple stories with history, and they didn't want to get into the complications of it. And it came from a veteran, and he was the commander of the division that came here. So why would he possibly not be telling the truth? It wasn't really until Edwin Coddington published the Gettysburg Campaign in 1968, I think was the year that came out. Coddington did question Heath's story, even though Coddington still couldn't even resist inserting the story in there about how he was going to get those shoes on July the 1st.
Right.
So it's kind of like the other famous myth of Gettysburg about the hooves on the equestrian statues on the monuments, the equestrian monuments in the battlefield. 1 hoof up, he was wounded. 2 hoofs up, he was killed. All 4 down, he made it through the battle okay. That
all 4
was
up.
All 4 up. There aren't any. So you find one of them.
All 4 up. He was in the Air Force.
Yeah. So that's one of those. Again, one of those cases where I'm sure early in the guiding period at Gettysburg, if you were a guide, what an easy way to tell people. Okay, if you want to remember what happened to these people, if you see 1 hoof up on the equestrian, that means he was wounded because there's 1 monument like that, or there's 2. There's one, and then there's one with two hooves up. That was General Reynolds. He was killed. All four down. Those guys made it through the battle. So you tell that story over decades, and people go home and they say, "Hey, I went to Gettysburg. This is a cool story I learned." Blah, 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 so they tell a story. So the shoe myth is kind of like that. Mm-hmm. It's a easy thing to go home and tell, and then that gets spread around. And once it gets spread and permeates the culture of your history, it's very, very difficult to dispel it, because people want to believe
they
that
want
it's
to.
true.
Yeah.
And you're just a revisionist when you question it.
Right.
So,
okay, let's separate fact from myth then. Was there ever any talk about possibly finding shoes in Gettysburg among Heath's in Heath's division, or between Heath and Hill, or anything?
Yes.
There was. Okay, so that is a fact.
That is a fact.
Okay.
But it wasn't on July the 1st.
Correct. All right, so go ahead. What was it?
It was on June 30th,
right.
The day before. The day before the battle begins, General Heath's division had marched over South Mountain to Cashtown Pass, and they had bivouacked around Cashtown, which is about 8-9 miles west of Gettysburg. And on June 30th, General Heath ordered his largest brigade, which was commanded by General James Pettigrew. It was about almost 3,000 men, to take a bunch of wagons from the division and march to Gettysburg. And they were to search the town for supplies, but particularly Heath had learned that there was some sort of a supply of shoes, and he wanted those shoes. So again, one of the perpetual myths of the Confederate Army is most of these guys didn't wear shoes. That's simply not true. The reason that Heath needed shoes was the same reason that Union division commanders needed shoes for their men. Many of the roads in Maryland and Pennsylvania, the good roads, were macadamized roads. And macadamized roads was crushed stone with packed dirt on top of it. That meant it was an all-weather road. So if you were on the Chambersburg Turnpike, that was a macadamized road. If you were on the Taneytown Road, that was a county road, that was a dirt road, that would turn into a mud pie if it rained a lot. So they don't have that same base. But that base, that rock base with packed dirt on top of it, was very difficult for somebody in bare feet to walk on for any length of time. So your soldiers would become lame, and you needed to get shoes for your men. And the other thing was, for a division commander like Heath, shoes that he's going to obtain in Pennsylvania are going to be better manufactured than anything he's going to get through the Confederate supply system.
Okay.
So he wants to get all the shoes that he possibly can obtain. So Pettigrew is ordered to search for supplies, but particularly for shoes, on June 30th. He is, of course, going to march towards Gettysburg that day. He got warned twice on the way to Gettysburg. One was a Confederate sympathizer from Gettysburg. The other, they said, was a spy in the employ of Longstreet, which could have been Harrison. The spy. We don't know. But both of them warned him that Federal cavalry was approaching Gettysburg from the south. And one of them, it might have been Harrison, told him who it was. He said it was Buford's division of cavalry from the Army of the Potomac. So that put Pettigrew on the alert. Pettigrew halted his division almost 2 miles from Gettysburg, and he advanced with a skirmish line up to the Lutheran Seminary on Seminary Ridge. And when he got to Seminary Ridge, and when he looked to the south or southeast towards the Emmitsburg Road, which comes up to Gettysburg from the south, he saw cavalry coming up, probably the advance guard of Buford's division. So that confirmed for Pettigrew that what he had been warned about was actually coming to pass. There was some type of cavalry approaching Gettysburg. And one of his staff members also believed he heard drums in Gettysburg. And there was a little band that came out to kind of celebrate Buford coming into town. So maybe those were the guys playing the drum. But there was no infantry in town. But Pettigrew's staff officer believed that might indicate that there was some infantry. They didn't know, was this militia or was this from the Army of the Potomac? But Pettigrew turned everybody around and he started to march back to Cashtown. And while he was doing so, he stayed near the rear of his column to personally observe the cavalry, which shadowed his movements. And by watching the cavalry, he was convinced that the cavalry was from the Army of the Potomac. They moved like trained soldiers, not like militia.
Okay.
So when he returns to Cashtown and reports to General Heath, his report is going to be, I could not enter Gettysburg because there was a large cavalry force occupied the town, and that cavalry force, I'm quite certain, is from the Army of the Potomac. Now, Pettigrew had served with the Army of Northern Virginia through the 7 days battles.
Okay.
But when the Army of Northern Virginia left the peninsula and they began to move north in the Second Manassas campaign, Pettigrew's brigade did not accompany the Army. And Pettigrew did not serve with the Army until June of 1863, a year later.
Okay.
So he misses Second Manassas, Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville. So if you're in Heath's shoes, Pettigrew he's just not that experienced, right? Mm-hmm. Yes, he's had combat under his belt. He's not that experienced. He might be exaggerating and seeing things and stuff that really isn't as dangerous as he thinks. So Heath doubted his report, whether he was accurate. He didn't doubt that he might have run into something, but he doubted that it was from the Army of the Potomac. And then when A.P. Hill arrived, the Corps commander, he comes up a little while, probably towards late afternoon, maybe evening of June 30th. Pettigrew is going to give his report to General Hill as well, and General Hill is also going to doubt that Pettigrew saw what he actually saw, which was cavalry from the Army of the Potomac. And Hill tells him that he'd just come from a meeting with Lee, and that Lee's scouts confirmed what A.P. Hill's scouts had already told him, which was the main body of the Army of the Potomac was still down in Maryland, probably about 20 miles from the Pennsylvania line. And they hadn't even, taken down their tents yet. So Hill was convinced that if there was anything in Gettysburg, it was just an observation force. And, but of course, he felt that they needed to do something about it. So there is this element of truth. Pettigrew does go to Gettysburg on June 30th to search Gettysburg for supplies and also for shoes, and he's not going to find anything because he's going to discover Union cavalry is there. And then that's where the story then begins to get complicated, and the individual who's going to complicate it is Henry Heath.
So who does he talk to? And how does it get complicated? So why is it turning into this? Why is the myth being born here? How does that happen?
It gets complicated because if you follow the timeline of how the shoe myth story begins, it makes much more sense than if you just simply go back to a document and look at it. So in 1877, the Comte de Paris, who was a French nobleman who had actually served as a volunteer aide on the staff of George B. McClellan during the Peninsula Campaign. Comte de Paris was very interested in the war, and he wanted to write a history of the war. And he corresponded he had a lot of contacts, both Union and Confederate. And he carried on an extensive correspondence. So it's important to realize at this point, if you follow the Civil War at all, many people have heard of something called the ORs, which is the official records. It is the War of the Rebellion compilation of the official records of the Union and Confederate armies in the Civil War. What that is all of the most important correspondence that takes place at the Army level for the most part, sometimes at Corps, maybe division level, but certainly at Army level and also to their central governments. It's all that correspondence for the entire war, and it is all of the after-action reports, because if you were a Union or Confederate Army officer and you were engaged in an operation or an action, you were obligated by law, even though sometimes people didn't do it, you were obligated by law to write an after-action report about that. We call those the official reports. So after a big battle like Gettysburg, everyone who was the surviving commanding officer from regiment, brigade, division, corps, army, battery, everyone was supposed to write a report. Not everybody did, but most people did. All of those reports were then compiled into the official records of the War of the Rebellion. So, for example, the Gettysburg Campaign is volume 27 of the official record.
Catch the rest of this episode and support the show over at patreon.com/addressinggettysburg.